For me, President William Henry Harrison is arguably one of the more interesting presidents in American history because of how boring he seems. He served the shortest amount of time for any president in American history, only serving as president for 1 month, and he's only really known for one thing before his presidency, which was the Battle of Tippecanoe, which ultimately helped him become elected president in the first place in 1840. And Harrison is a complete enigma regarding his own views on issues and a lot of his policy stances. In fact, many historians who know a lot about presidents who most of the public don't know nothing about Harrison. And because of how enigmatic he is, and also the short amount of time he was president, I think it's interesting to ask the question, what if Harrison didn't die and instead served out his full term as president? As we know, Harrison is known. The only thing Harrison is known for president during his short time in office was his inauguration speech, which was the longest in American history. In fact, people speculate that this inauguration speech was so long and Harrison was standing without a coat in the cold weather, and this ultimately gave him a cold that led to him dying. This is false, though, because the real reason why Harrison actually died was because the White House water was contaminated, and this ultimately led to him contracting a disease that ultimately killed him. This also killed President Zachary Taylor, who died just a decade after Harrison, and it also may have killed President James Polk, who died just 1 month after leaving office. So yeah, Harrison's death was ultimately not due to his inauguration speech, but nonetheless, it definitely hurt the Whig Party because it led to John Tyler becoming president, and John Tyler clashed with the Whigs on many issues regarding domestic policy and was much more of a Democrat than a Whig, honestly, when it came towards domestic issues. However, if you look at what Harrison would have done if he had been president instead of Tyler on domestic policy, you just have to look at his inauguration address where he details several things. Harrison promised to defer to Congress and largely promised the role of a limited president. This was something John Tyler did not do because Tyler also clashed with Congress on many issues, so we likely would not see Harrison use the veto very often and would very likely defer to Congress most of the time. Harrison also promised to restore the Bank of the United States, which Andrew Jackson had removed. In many ways, Harrison's inauguration address basically had him call for himself to be the anti-Jackson in a sense. He called for limited power for the presidency, which was not what Andrew Jackson did, and also called for the reinstitution of the National Bank, the same institution that Andrew Jackson abolished. Harrison would also support the few Whig agenda policies that John Tyler himself did support, which included the Tariff of 1842. In fact, Harrison would probably support more tariffs than John Tyler did in our own scenario. Harrison would also support internal improvements and infrastructure, which was something that John Tyler opposed due to him viewing it as unconstitutional. But I don't see Harrison vetoing bills by the Whig Congress regarding something like this. And I ultimately think the institution of internal improvements would result in a more speedy recovery from the Panic of 1837 than the actual recovery we had under John Tyler's presidency. I think also the reinstitution of the Bank of the United States would also speed up the recovery from the panic. Regarding foreign policy, I think one of John Tyler's few strengths as president was his foreign policy, and I seriously think that William Henry Harrison would have the exact same foreign policy because he had Daniel Webster as his Secretary of State, and Webster was the main architect of Tyler's foreign policy, so I don't really see this changing with Harrison as president. However, one massive difference, though, in foreign policy, I guess you could say, would be Texas annexation. John Tyler was all in on Texas annexation, but the Whig Congress ultimately did not allow him to do so. But I think Harrison would likely align with the Whigs in Congress in opposing Texas annexation and would not aggressively move for Texas annexation. So, despite Texas's attempts to be annexed by the United States, Texas would ultimately remain independent throughout the Harrison presidency, and with Tyler's aggressive annexation attempts not being here in this alternate scenario, we would ultimately see that the issue of Texas annexation would not be all that pressing except for a few radicals in the Deep South who would want to expand slavery. Martin Van Buren would actually likely be the Democratic Party's nominee in 1844, believe it or not, because he almost was, and the only reason he wasn't nominated was due to his opposition to Texas annexation. But with this not really being as much of an issue anymore, I can easily see Van Buren being the 1844 Democrat nominee. Harrison would still ultimately win the election, though. His first term overall would have gone smoothly and would have been a recovery from Van Buren's disastrous first term as president. So, yeah, Van Buren's attempt to get a non consecutive second term would ultimately fail, and Harrison would be reelected, albeit by a smaller margin. So the main thing over Harrison's second term would be regarding Texas, California, as well as Oregon. I think Harrison would maintain the current policy of joint occupation in Oregon and would not be nearly as aggressive as James Polk. I think California would also remain Mexican territory, and Harrison would not want to seek a war with Mexico. As to the same thing, which is why Texas would remain independent. Ultimately, though, this would have the impact in 1848. Without a Mexican American War, the election of 1848 would not have Zachary Taylor or Winfield Scott because their rise to fame was largely due to this conflict. Thus, I think the Whigs would also have a very weak bench because by this time, Henry Clay was in very poor health and he was basically dying. So he would not have been a feasible candidate either. So I think they would have ultimately gone with Daniel Webster, who was also quite old in 1848 and whose health wasn't that great, but not as bad as Henry Clay's was. The Democrats would have also likely nominated Lewis Cass for the nomination, and the Free Soil Party wouldn't really be much of an issue this time, largely because the expansion of slavery into the territories would not be an issue without the new territories from the Mexican American War. With this in mind, I think Lewis Cass would quite easily win the election, mostly because Daniel Webster, his health was sort of an issue this election, and Lewis Cass would be able to appease to the South and the North simultaneously. And I think more Americans would just want the extra land from Texas as well as Mexico as well as California. So with the Cass presidency, I think Texas would be annexed by the United States, although it would happen 4 years later, and we would also have a Mexican-American War, although again, 4 years later. Ultimately, we would see California and Texas into the United States, and Oregon would also be into the United States. I think the joint occupation would end around this time period, and we would ultimately have the same America that we had under James Polk, just under Lewis Cass instead. So Cass would ultimately run for re-election, and he would run against Zachary Taylor, who I think would be the Whigs nominee again in this scenario, mostly because they would just want to replicate Harrison's success in 1840. But this would not go over as well, mostly because I don't think the Free Soil Party would be as strong this time, due to Van Buren likely not running, and thus New York would probably go to Lewis Cass instead of to Zachary Taylor, which went to him in our own scenario due to a split vote. So ultimately, I think Cass would win re-election, also due to his own popularity from the Mexican-American War. So unlike James Polk, who only ran for one term then retired, I think Cass would be a two-term president. So in Cass's second term, we would have the issue of the Compromise of 1850, though without Webster and Clay, because by this time both of them would have been dead. The compromise, I think, would have taken a lot longer to solve, though I also doubt that it would have been as negative, partly because John C. Calhoun would also be dead by this time. So with Clay, Calhoun, and Webster all gone, I think the compromise of 1850 would still go through, largely because Calhoun isn't there, and his whole radicalism wouldn't really be that much there in this alternate scenario. So we would still see the compromise of 1850. I think its provisions, though, are still very similar. You would still see California added as a free state, and you would also still see the fugitive slave law. And then ultimately, Franklin Pierce would be elected in the next cycle, although in 1856 instead of 1852. And that's basically it. The Whig Party would still dissolve due to disagreements over the compromise. And basically, we have the same scenario as we do in our own history, except just transferred 4 years later. So ultimately, all that William Henry Harrison really is just the great delayer if he ends up surviving and serving for two terms as president. He's likely viewed as just an average president in American history, basically just did what Congress told him to do, So, yeah, there's that. That's what happens if William Henry Harrison survives and is president for 8 years. Basically, just the Civil War gets delayed by 4 years and happens in 1864 or in 1865, whenever you think it starts, instead of 1861. So, anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel. Mr. US History, out.